Welcome back. You're listening to Federal Insights, Understanding the Versatility of Crowdsourced Cybersecurity, sponsored by HackerOne on Federal News Network. I'm your host, Jason Miller. My guest today is Alex Rice, the co-founder and chief technology officer at HackerOne. Alex, before break, we're understanding what the different types of, if you will, crowdsourced cybersecurity there is. We talked about VDP, we talked about bug bounties. Let's talk a little bit about actually incorporating hackers into your security program. It seems easy. You made it sound like, oh, I just have to call you guys up and you guys come over and do it. It's never that easy. So walk me through, what should agencies keep in mind as they're trying to set up these types of programs? What are some of the challenges? What are some of the benefits? Walk me through it.
Yeah, it's a great question, Jason. Let's maybe start with some of the obvious, which is you should bring in this diverse group of hackers after you've done your other best practices, right? This isn't where you start with a cybersecurity program. So if you're in the early stages of defining your cybersecurity program, going deep with bounty programs is not the right starting point. You want to use this as a last line of defense and validation that your other mechanisms are doing what they say they will, and their other controls will. So hackers come in to test the overall efficacy of your program and point out blind spots to you. From there, there's the vulnerability disclosure policies that we talked about before. I'll kind of put those aside for a second because I really do believe that's just a good hygiene practice that everybody should have. And it's not explicitly incorporating hackers into your program at that point or asking them to participate, but it's ensuring that you're not missing out on any intelligence that someone on the internet might be aware of. So if you're at the stage where you're deliberately thinking about how do I augment my cybersecurity program with hackers and rewarding them for it, there's a few things to keep in mind as you go about it. First things first, hackers are going to find things. Like nobody runs these programs and doesn't learn something they didn't know beforehand. And so you want to make sure you're in a position to be able to action those findings. Typically into a vulnerability management program, but you want to think about what are all of the things that we're asking hackers to look for, and what are we going to do about it once they find it? And you should assume that they will find it. That means making very close allies with your vulnerability management and incident response practices before you kick this off. From there, there's two main types of programs that we run and we recommend. One we talked about a little bit before the break around the point in time assessment types. These are really meant to look and feel like a traditional security assessment. And if you've ever bought an external pen test before, it'll feel very similar to that. It's kind of a point in time with a lot of control and vetting over what exactly occurs during those assessments. And you should think about complementing your pen testing program with that type of program. It's not meant as a replacement for your pen testing program. It's meant to add more diversity, more perspective in a very cost-effective way. For the more mature organizations out there, the ones that are really hungry for security feedback or the stakes are very high, the most powerful aspect of these types of programs is the ability to evolve them into a continuous security testing program. These are the type of bounty programs that you see folks like Google and Facebook pioneering. Microsoft and Amazon are huge proponents of them as well at this point. You're starting to see more traditional enterprises embrace them as well. So folks like Goldman Sachs and General Motors and the like that. And these are the same concept as the programs we were talking about before, but they run continuously throughout the year. They're meant to find and explore a new attack surface fast and continually surface security feedback into your security programs.
From your experience, are agencies more willing to do the point in time than the continuous one? Are you seeing a little bit of both?
Across the board, folks are more familiar with doing the point in time security assessment. Everyone's kind of familiar with the annual or quarterly or once a release pen test. And that's natural, but it's also insufficient. If the annual pen test was enough, none of us would be here. We wouldn't have these jobs anymore. And so hopefully that's not a surprise to anyone. And it's not a knock on those services. They provide a lot of value. They're just incompatible with the modern attack surface, how modern software is built. Anyone who's moving to a cloud environment or a continuous release environment, you've got to up your testing cadence to a level that's not fixed on a calendar. And these programs are a very seamless way to do that.
We hear agencies and CISA specifically talk a lot about continuous monitoring. That CDM program, as an example, is something that a lot of agencies spend a lot of time and money on. It seems like that's the same idea here. You just can't, look at it once, because in an hour, in 10 minutes, in 12 seconds, things could change. And that's why this continuous testing, this continuous monitoring is so important. Is it easier now for agencies to get their head around it because they have that experience with programs like CDM?
I think so. I think so. But there's also a little bit of a one is there's elements of our attack surface that are relatively fixed and stable and finite, where you might not need continuous security testing. But anywhere where you're applying continuous software development, you should have a strategy for how you continuously test and keep up with the pace of that. And most of us have something in our attack surface that fits that description, and it's probably growing faster than we're aware of and what we expect. And so I kind of put two on the question there, Jason. It is similar to the continuous monitoring that we do in the past, but it's really specifically targeted at places where things are continually changing.
And I think that's the key piece here, right? Because if you have, let's pick on disaster recovery, that probably doesn't change very often unless you have a disaster. That's supposed to be a very static
Unless
type of.
2020, right?
Exactly. That's just 2020. Exactly. But I imagine when you talk about DevSecOps as an example, which is continually changing, that's where having this type of tool set becomes important. So does automation, orchestration, you hear a lot of those words get thrown in there. Is that part of this? Or is that's kind of more of the separate swim lane for a lot of the security efforts?
It's a feedback loop into it, absolutely, and that's how I would encourage everyone to think about these programs. Is hackers are producing feedback into those security programs, and you need to make sure you can do something with that feedback. But this is a bit of a ancillary output from these programs. But one of the things people struggle with in trying to apply that level of automation around it is you don't get to test it as often as you would like. Like, does my incident response process work? Does the escalation processes work? How quickly are we able to remediate things? What's our overall speed in responding to an incident? We don't test that at a regular cadence. It tends, if you're doing quarterly pen tests, for example, you tend to only test those processes once a quarter or when an incident occurs. And in reality, you need to be exercising that muscle on a much more frequent cadence. And the continuous programs from hackers provide the input mechanism to not just surface that finding in the first place, but to ensure your end-to-end remediation process is a well-tuned machine.
Alex, I want to go back to something you said just a little while ago, that this type of approach is really good for things that change often. But so okay, that makes sense for software, but what about hardware? What about mobile devices? What about the network? I mean,
Yeah.
where there's all these technology assets that are now part of the attack surface.
Yeah, that's exactly right. My comment on the things that change often was specifically for the continuous programs, right? If you are in a place where you're shipping something that's a little bit more fixed, that's still a great fit for a point in time assessment on it. What I would advise people to do in an environment like that is to make sure you're not just testing the fixed point in time thing, but you're testing it continuously in the context of its environment. So you can do all of the testing in the world on an individual SCADA or industrial control system device, for example, which only gives you a part of the puzzle until you really assess what environment is it deployed into? How has that environment changed? And even though the individual device isn't changing on a regular basis, hopefully, its environment is changing a lot more frequently than most of us realize.
Want to go down one last path because we're just about out of time. But before I let you go, there's this idea that this type of approach, crowdsourced cybersecurity, VDP, bug bounty, is not the end all be all. You mentioned earlier that you got to do all the other things right, but as agencies begin to want to start to add these approaches, what are things they should keep in mind? How do they find the right balance between normal, quote unquote, normal cybersecurity, right? Antivirus, uh, firewalls and the like, and then on top of that adding these pen testing and other types of good hacker approaches.
Oh, it's such a great topic. Feedback is the most valuable thing we have in cybersecurity. And the problem with it traditionally is it's too slow, too infrequent. You have to wait for an incident in order to learn what's working, what's not working about your program. The benefit of hackers is fast feedback all the time. And the strongest cyber programs out there thrive on quickly incorporating feedback and responding to it.
And I think that's the key. Responding to it, as you mentioned earlier, incident response. As you mentioned, you got to know that there's problems, because there are problems,
That's
and
right.
you need to do something about it. So
That's exactly right.
great advice. And unfortunately, we're out of time for today. So this was a great conversation. I really appreciate it. So let me thank my guest. Alex Rice is the co-founder and chief technology officer at HackerOne. Alex, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you, Jason. Really enjoyed it.
I'm Jason Miller, and you've been listening to Federal Insights, Understanding the Versatility of Crowdsourced Cybersecurity, sponsored by HackerOne on Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search HackerOne.